and welcome to Stockyard Sessions, brought to you by Atlas Ag, the team behind Atlas Carbon and Atlas Grazing. I'm your host, Victoria Lawrance, and a proud member of the Atlas Ag team. This podcast is about going back to the beginning, the soil, the decisions, and the people who aren't afraid to rethink how things have always been done. Today, I'm joined by Richard Brimblecombe, someone who's spent decades across Australian agribusinesses, including various roles at NAPCo, Nutrien, GRDC and StockCo. He's now co-founder, managing director and CEO of Legacy Livestock, a livestock finance business, and also runs his own cattle property in Queensland. He's seen the industry from just about every angle: corporate scale, commercial systems, advisory roles, and hands-on grazing, which gives him a pretty rare perspective on how things actually work in practice. Richard, welcome to Stockyard Sessions.
Thanks, Vic. It's great to join you.
So let's start at the very beginning. You've worked across a pretty wide mix of agribusiness systems and now running your own business. What stands out to you about how good decisions actually get made in agriculture?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the point that keeps coming to my mind is around context. So I think in agriculture, I guess as with most businesses, but I suspect more so with agriculture, the context of the environment that people are operating within is constantly changing. And many of those factors are outside the control of producers. So weather, markets, those sorts of things. And they drive really, really important decisions and can have really material effects. So I think good decision makers are constantly feeding in up-to-date information about their context so that the decision they're making is most relevant to their context at the time. And obviously really important to also, ensure that the decisions being made, reflect those changing circumstances and are updated regularly.
Yeah. Well, I guess in the view of context, when you compare, say, a corporate scale operation to running your own country, how different does that decision-making feel day to day?
Yeah, the decision-making feels quite similar because I think at the end of the day, it's sort of the scale that differs, but all of the principles are the same. So, there might be a few more zeros on the end at a corporate level, but really the quality of the decisions remain the same. So it's about making sure you've got good quality data to input into those decisions and, making sure that you're really aware of the context that you're making those decisions in and trying to be holistic in your approach. So, whether you're a corporate or a family farming business, you've got all sorts of stakeholders that are impacted by your decisions. And, often there's less governance and you can be a little bit more nimble. But I still think, in a family farming business versus a corporate, but I still think, having a base level of governance is still really important.
So it's all about relativity.
Yeah, exactly.
So across those different roles, what do you think people outside of the industry most misunderstand about how grazing business or agriculture in general actually operate?
I think, the sort of city-country divide, is widening, and I think that's a shame. And I think the big misconception, and, it's been somewhat driven, by, agendas, is really, I think very few people understand that most primary producers see themselves as stewards of the land. They're incredibly focused on sustainability. And the reason they are is that, they are managing an intergenerational asset for their family. And so, of course, they're going to do things that preserve the quality of that landscape and the ecology, of the environment they're managing for the long term. And I think it's a given that that's the fundamental starting point for pretty well every farming business. And it is a shame, I think that's not well understood outside of farming circles.
Yeah, so what do you think has changed the most then in the way that agricultural businesses are run over, the course of your career that you've seen?
Yeah, I'm seeing the use of a lot more data. So, we've got better at collecting data and better at using that data to feed into important decisions, and whether it's around EBVs on the genetics that you're using, so looking to use data to improve the genetic base of your herd, whether it's collecting data around stock days per hectare per 100 mils of rain, those sorts of things. I've got a fly annoying me here today, so apologies for that.
Part of the agricultural landscape, right, Richard?
Yeah, exactly. He's making a little cameo appearance, but probably annoy me for the whole interview by the looks. But anyway, I think, that's a key for me is just that focus on ecology, focus on data, and using that data to make better and better decisions. I think we do much more of that today as family farmers than we have before. And a lot of the apps that are used, for example, Atlas Grazing and others are really helping to make that easier and to collect and then use that data to feed into really better decisions.
Yeah, so it sounds like the tech side of things and the data collection and utilisation of that, which is key, is probably one of the main things where the industry has really genuinely improved. Is there anything else you see within the industry as a whole that's really improved over your time? And, where do you think we're potentially still stuck in some old thinking?
Yeah, well, I think, in terms of other improvements, we are much more focused on carbon more generally now. And I think I don't like using the word regenerative because it means different things to different people. But I think we have naturally become, producers have naturally become more interested and more focused on ecology and ecological impacts of the way they run their business and what that means for them and their families in the longer term. So I think, there's a greater curiosity and a greater awareness, I think, around those things. And, I think the good things that haven't changed is that we are still very much, family-run businesses. We're local families, teaching our children, good values, raising them, in small communities, and that, that village effect and that village feel is something that I hope we never lose, to be honest.
Yeah. Do you think that focus on ecology, land stewardship, land management, whatever bucket, people want to put themselves in, is that what separates consistent good operators, do you think, in this space? Or is there something else that you think is a key driver for those consistently good land managers or graziers?
Yeah, so I think I wouldn't necessarily, make the comment that to be a good producer, you've got to be engaged in sort of, those regenerative practices. I think there are lots of people that have found a way to farm really well and really responsibly in the context of, their family farm and how, they've chosen to farm. And I think that means different things for different people. And, we're all operating on different knowledge bases. So, if all I've ever known is, conventional farming, synthetic fertilizers, those sorts of things, then I'm probably going to continue to do that unless I'm challenged in some way to think out of the square. But if it's working for me and if I am managing my country in a responsible way, then, all credit to you. And I think, so I sort of don't like to try and polarize the conversation around, one philosophy around farming is better than another. But what I am seeing is that people are generally becoming much more curious and much more interested in the impacts of the decisions they're making from a management perspective on the long-term sustainability of their operation. And I think that's, leading people to challenge some things that, have historically been accepted as the norm. And it's, causing others to really have a very deep think about challenging the firmly held beliefs of dad and granddad and grandmother and mother, those sorts of things. So that level of curiosity, I think, that I'm seeing in the industry is really healthy.
Yeah. So I guess down that path, talking about decision-making and risk, for you, what does good decision-making look like on the ground in the grazing business?
It's a great question, and I think, they're all easy in hindsight. But look, the best way to make a good decision, I think, is to, really make sure you're collecting good quality data, make sure you're giving consideration in a holistic way to the context of your current situation. And if I reflect on our position here at the moment on the Western Downs in southern Queensland, we're very, very dry, and long-term average rainfall here is probably 580 mils with very, quite high summer dominance. On a rolling 12-month basis, we're at about 467 here now, so we're 120 mils below our long-term average. But I think it's actually worse because it's not just how you measure the rain, but it's the way it's fallen. And in the last 12 months, we've had a very high number of very small rain events that really haven't made a contribution to pasture growth. So we're probably actually worse than it looks. And I think, giving consideration to those nuances and being curious about not just the data, but how it's come together results in better decisions. So that curiosity and that constant challenging of, well, this is an accepted norm, but, why is an accepted norm? Should I consider other information? Should I consider things differently? But I just keep coming back to, what I have found in my personal journey is that the more good quality data that I collect and that I can then utilise to factor into a decision generally results in better decisions being made.
So does that, when you're starting to really get into the granular details of your data and looking at long-term trends, does that help you then balance that long-term land condition decision with short-term commercial pressure?
Yeah, it absolutely does, because you do, I think that's a great point you've made, is that you've got this natural tension in any farming business. You've got, I need to make decisions around short-term cash flow and short-term financial commitments and those sorts of things, but I also need to balance that with the longer-term impacts. And so, that's a natural tension that exists in all businesses. And I think, the better farmers are the ones that understand that tension and, carefully considering those trade-offs in their decisions. And, as for an example here, we are dry. Our target stock days per hectare, or stock days per hectare per 100 mils is, around about 20. We've been travelling well under that for the last 12 months, but we're spiking up quite rapidly now as the rainfall's moving away. And we started making decisions around reducing stocking rate, back in December, which was very hard because we'd just received 90 mils of rain. But we made that decision because the last two summers had been quite disappointing, and it looked like this one might go the same way. And our view was, well, the quicker we make an adjustment, the more flexibility we'll have down the track if this dry period continues. And we made another significant reduction in February in terms of numbers on hand here, and that gave us some more breathing room. And we brought the cows into preg test on the 15th of April, and normally we wouldn't wean here until July, mid-July. And this year we actually took those cows off the cows to preg test them, and we made a decision to keep them off, and they're all being fed now. And again, that's just buying us more time and buying us more room. And they're all decisions that are made based on us looking at our stock days per hectare per 100 mil and how we're travelling against our target. And we probably can go over a little because we've been under for some time. So we've got a lot of pretty good pasture in front of us, but we're not growing any behind us. And so, all of that information is being considered all of the time. And we're trying to be very timely in our decisions here. We think, it's very important to act early, particularly when things are adverse.
And I think that's a really tough time for everyone to then see that bigger picture and really balance that long-term play with what's right in front of you when that can turn in the season. Do you think that's where some grazing businesses can get the decision-making wrong without that wider lens of looking at what's come before and potentially what's coming ahead?
I think so. Certainly in my lifetime, I've seen people struggle with, that decision of being very disciplined in understanding, or using some sort of a dynamic measure that really gives you good feedback about how your stocking rate measures up against your carrying capacity at any point in time. And we know that's a dynamic number that's driven by rain and stock numbers and those sorts of things. And I think historically, a traditionally run business, hasn't considered those numbers. I think whilst they haven't collected the data and necessarily considered those numbers, they're observing what's happening in the paddocks, they're making views. But for me, the decision-making gets so much easier when you've got hard numbers, you've got a dynamic target that you're shooting for. It enables you to feel much more confident in making adjustments and making them early, whereas I think in the absence of that data, those decisions are really heart-wrenching. For example, here we've spent many years building up to a target number of breeders. We've only kind of just got there. And now, the decisions we're making are which ones are we letting go? And it's not should we let them go? It's like we know based on the data that it's going to be, and if we want to manage for the long term and keep future management flexibility, at play as much as we can, then we've got to make difficult decisions early here, and which we're doing at the current time.
So I guess that, that might have come from a place of, like you said, a bit of heartache. Have you reflected on that in the past, your own decisions and experience, and is there anything you'd approach differently?
Yeah, I think we are approaching things very differently because we're very committed to operating the business within our target stock days per hectare per 100 mils. So that's a really important number for us. It's a dynamic measure of how well we're matching carrying capacity and stocking rate, and we know, and it's not a perfect measure, none of these things are, but we're big believers in the 80-20, the Pareto rule here, and we know that it's a very simple measure that delivers very effective information and is very predictive, and is powerfully predictive. So we find that once you distill it down to numbers that relate back to long-term health of the farm and the business, the decisions get much easier. Much easier to make a hard decision when you feel that you've got good quality data to base the decision on. For
sure. Yeah, it's less of that gut feel and more understanding the patterns that have come before and probably the decisions that were made or lost with experience that you've got. So on your place now, is that the main key driver of your performance, being able to see where that balance lies between your stocking rate and your carrying capacity within the data, or are there other key performance indicators that you would look at in a typical year?
Yeah, well, for us, that is the big one. And we're then overlaying that with a bit of a subjective view of the quality of the rainfall. So not just the quantum, but how has it fallen and when it's fallen, because rainfall in the winter months here doesn't prompt much pasture growth. We've got very summer dominant species and that which prompts us to then think, well, are there opportunities for us to diversify our pasture mix and get some winter dominant species or some species that will react more positively to winter rain and try and balance that feed out a little bit. I think, there are limitations there, but there are things that we should be considering and which we are. And we, historically, we would never have done that. So we're very focused on that stock days per hectare per 100 mils because, that's the big thing we can do to keep us in good shape. And then I think, underneath that, we're constantly looking at our genetics and the performance of our genetics. We're constantly looking at levers we can pull to keep our body condition score of our breeder base, as where we want it to be, and so because we know that impacts significantly on the productivity of the breeder herd, and so there's a myriad of things that we're considering every day, and sometimes they're somewhat ambiguous or in conflict with each other, and then you've got to be able to work your way through that conflict or that friction that exists in a business about where your priorities lie and which thing you're going to bias towards, if you like. So which one is going to override another important decision, or consideration in your business. So it's not easy, it's complex, and I think that's one of the great things about Australian farmers and Australian farming families. We're by and large very resilient, and I know when my city friends come out and visit us here, and we talk to them about the things we consider in running our business and how we go about it and the data we collect and how we use that information, they're shocked because it's, it's just a farm. It's very simple. Whereas I think when they start to engage with us and understand the complexity that we're managing, their eyes really sort of, pop wide open and say, oh, wow, this is actually a very complex, difficult business proposition. And so there's an appreciation then, I guess, of how effective, by and large, Australian farming managers are.
That's one step towards the bridging that city-country divide that you're doing.
We're going to get them out here on farm more often. Find a way.
Absolutely. So I guess when you're looking at all those myriad of decisions day to day, how much of them are planned and how much is just responsive to current conditions?
Yeah, the way we think about it is we don't like being reactive here. So, I mean, I think every farmer has to be to a certain extent, but the way we think about it is it's like, let's try and project forward. Let's, capture as much information as we can. Let's understand what our key drivers are and our key sort of philosophies. And then let's, constantly update the information here. Because I have had a corporate background, we do have a reasonably formal month-end process here that you might not see in a normal farming business, but we sort of close the books off. We're updating our LSU and stocking rate, those sorts of things, and then projecting forward and going, well, based on the extra 30 days of information we now have, what does that mean for the next 12 months? And so we're constantly reviewing updated information, constantly, challenging our current thinking about the forecast and making decisions. We never want to be in a decision where, for example, we are trucking cattle off here because we have no other option. We want to be making the decisions. We want to have optionality all the time, and we want to be selecting, the best option available whilst there are still multiple good options available, rather than, letting the thing close down and being very reactive. And it's like, well, we have no choice here. We've got to sell these cows in the local cattle yard because they're in poor condition. They're not going to be acceptable to a processor. We can't get a premium price. We've just got to take what the market's going to give us. And so we try and avoid that at all costs. And so rather than be reactive, the way I think about it is we just constantly looking to capture and feed information in, and whether it's data or whether it's simply an updated observation. So, they say the best fertilizer is a farmer's boots, and, there's still, you can have all the apps in the world and capture all the data in the world, but there is still, you've got to match it off with getting out in the paddock, being clear about what you're seeing, observing changes, and fitting that into your decision making.
Yeah, for sure. I guess when talk us through your landscape out at Glen Morgan, and when you see things changing on the land, whether that's for the better or the worse, what does that actually look like for you?
Yeah, so I mean, we bought this place, in middle of 2000, so around about 6 years ago now. And, at that time, we were just emerging from an absolute rip-roaring dry period, across most of Eastern Australia. And this, it's the whole property here looked like it had been hit with a set of offset discs. You just, you had to walk a very long way to find a piece of pasture. And it was a pretty sad environment. And I got hugely excited about when I saw it, because I felt there was a great buying opportunity, because a lot of other people had looked at the property and walked away when it's a really tough project here. And we saw potential, and my wife and I, and it was, which can be an expensive word, but so what we're focused on, and since we've been here, is really trying to manage in a way where we're promoting diversity of pasture, trying to manage in a way where we're giving the pasture an opportunity to fill in. So we're managing for soil cover. We're trying to get the plant population up. We're trying to get the plant density up, and also the diversity up. And we've seen some really exciting changes in the 6 years we've been here, prompted by, gradual management changes that we've been making. And we're sort of fiddled on the edges a little bit before, and we'll probably come to the carbon project a little later, but, fiddled on the edges with our thinking. And it was really, some observations around changes that drove us to really want to consider a carbon project. But yeah, we're very focused on the long-term ecological improvement of this place, because we think that is actually going to be the best profit driver in the long run for this, for this business.
Do you see then that tension between improving pasture conditions and the time it takes to do that and maintaining profitability?
Yeah, I think there is it depends if you take a short-term or long-term view of profitability. So, that short-term cash hit's nice, but if you're not leaving anything behind, then you're going to pay the tax next graze. And so, I think you've got to have, in agriculture, to be successful, you have to have that longer-term view. You have to be able to look through, some of the shorter-term considerations, and you've got to be responsible. I mean, we've all got an overdraft we've got to operate within, and those sorts of things. So, everything is a challenge. Everything's a compromise. So, sometimes we are making suboptimal decisions because we've got some other constraint, which might be a cash flow constraint or something else in the business, and you've just got to accept those and do the best you can within the constraints that that exist in your business. But I think you can always be optimizing. And so, there are compromises and there are challenges, but I think if you're always trying to optimize the outcome within the constraints you've got, then you're always going to be getting, sort of this compounding effect of better decisions over a long period of time.
Yeah. So with that optimization, what does that look like for you in terms of, the good grazing practices that you try to do or you are doing or you want to do?
Yeah. So look, when we first bought the place, we had agistment cattle here. We didn't own any of our own cattle. I was sort of busy running another business, and over time, we've decided to make the move to live here and establish our own enterprise. But we've transitioned from a set stocking business to a real focus on stock density. So we are absolutely convinced that high density for a short graze with a long rest is really benefiting the property, and we are seeing a succession of diversity of species in the pasture. On the back of that, we're seeing those gaps filling in, the areas of exposed soil filling in very quickly, and so we're sort of seeing that soil cover improving dramatically as well. So we sort of we played around a little bit with, I wouldn't really call it, it's not it's controlled time grazing. And, since we've registered the carbon project, we've become very, very focused on trying to get our mob size up and our density up and our graze period down and rest period up, because we're absolutely convinced of the ecological benefits we're seeing emanating from that. I mean, at the end of the day, we're kind of using cattle as a tool here to solve for long-term sustainability and ecological outcomes.
So let's talk about that carbon project for a little while. And I guess at what point did you see the soil carbon project shift from being something that you had heard about to something you actually started taking seriously and considering?
I sort of went on a bit of a journey around, and I guess you could use the word regen. So, read a lot of books, read Holistic Management by Alan Savory, and that sort of prompted me to read other books, Andrei Vosin, Grass Productivity, who was a major influencer, I think, on Savory's thinking. And that book, dates back to the 1940s, but, the more I read it, it's like, wow, this guy, he was like so far ahead of his time. And there were others even before him that were onto it, and so it's not as new as we think, which is cool. I watched a lot of video stuff. I've watched a lot of Gabe Brown's stuff. I've read his book, and all of those things, I guess bit by bit just made me start to challenge, my thinking, my philosophy, and made me curious about exploring alternatives and, was there a different way to doing things rather than, the way, I had been taught growing up. So I think what's really healthy for farmers is accumulate as much information as you can. And if you've got a view, read as much information as you can about the opposing view and educate yourself on the opposing view as well as, because I think, in this day of social media and those sorts of things, all of those algorithms are designed to, once they pick up what you're interested in, they just feed you more of that. And I think the healthy thing for us as individuals is, if we have a view, then educate yourself on the other side of the view. And I think it results in much more balance and becoming better informed and better able to make better decisions.
Yeah, so I guess going down that path of looking at the other side, you would have had a lot of questions and potentially hesitations about stepping into it. What were the biggest ones?
Yeah, well, for me, it's like, well, what are the real benefits? Are there real benefits? Number one, because we probably are quite a bit busier now than we have been. We're moving cattle more often than we have, as an example. And are there benefits to that? And they're the sort of decisions that we have had to, work through very carefully. I guess weighing it all up and then, dipping our toe in the water and making a few practice changes here and then observing different outcomes, really made us want to go a little bit further and explore a little bit more and, go a bit further. And then, as you go down that path, you start to realise that carbon and particularly soil carbon is a really, really important piece of the puzzle. And so if you want to increase the rate at which your land will absorb moisture, you want to increase the length of time it can hold that moisture, which are two pretty important, things to drive pasture growth or optimization of pasture growth in your property. You realise very quickly that carbon is super important. And so I think, it became a natural extension of that journey we went on. We didn't start out thinking about carbon, but the journey led us to carbon and led us to realise that making a pretty significant practice change to promote the sequestration of carbon had many, many different layers of benefits for the business, just one of which is financial.
So looking at carbon as a proxy or a marker of, a wider range of ecological benefits to the land and how much pasture you can actually grow, is that what ultimately tipped the decision for you? Were there other factors in that?
It was one of the major considerations. As I say, I think there's sort of many layers to the decisions, but we came to realise very quickly that we needed to manage in a way that maximised or optimised the level of carbon sequestration, and we wanted to manage the property in a way that did promote the sequestration of carbon. We are very committed to doing what we can to try and raise our soil organic carbon content here, because we know that there are lots of benefits there in the soil, but also I think those grazing practice changes, they do result in better soil cover, and that and then you get this virtuous cycle. As you've got better soil cover, you again, it promotes better carbon sequestration. More pasture diversity actually makes your business more robust, because I think if you've got a pasture monoculture, and we sort of see this in some of the buffel pastures in central Queensland, I'm absolutely of the view that having a monoculture leaves you exposed to things like dieback. And so I think the more diversity you have, the less exposed you are to shocks to your system, because one species or two or three species can be impacted by something that's changed, but you might have another 4, 5, 6 or 7 that are not. And so you've got a much more robust system that's capable of dealing with changes and challenges. So that diversity, I think is very important, because it gives you a much more stable platform.
For someone who hasn't been through it, what does a soil carbon project actually involve on the ground?
Well, I guess for us, we had to research a partner that would support us and in the project, and there are a number of people out there. We did a lot of due diligence and sort of narrowed it down to 2 and formed the view that Atlas Carbon were a great fit for us, and we liked the stability of the team and the approach. It fitted with our philosophy, so that decision became easy. So one is choosing a partner. 2 is then getting your head around the eligibility criteria associated with a carbon project. So for us, it meant that we would have to commit to a material practice change to demonstrate that additionality. And we'd been playing around the fringes and building our knowledge and understanding to a point where we became comfortable that we could make that decision. And certainly the potential for some financial benefits accruing from that, in addition to the ecological benefits, really made the decision to go down that path much easier. So we know it's a longer term commitment and a longer term opportunity, but if there is an opportunity to generate either assets or cash from carbon credits by doing something that's good for your land, then it felt like a sensible decision for us. Philosophically, we had, through the research we'd done and the reading and the YouTube watching, and we've certainly read a lot of literature. The lead up to it, we formed the view that it made sense for us, and we think that it will result in our business being more robust in the long term in terms of its ability to minimise the impact of particularly environmental shocks, on the basis that that practice change is coupled with good management, but also provide that kind of virtuous circle of improving outcomes in the long term as well.
I know there's a lot of chat in the industry about the complexity of these projects and, many different avenues people can go down and a bit of murkiness out there. So what part of that process was more straightforward than you expected and what was more complex?
Yeah, I think just the registration process itself was quite painful for us. I think, there was some hold up that meant it took a long time with the clean energy regulator, and I don't actually understand what the hold up was. They just took a long time, and that was frustrating for us. But I think our engagement with Atlas has been great. We've had good guidance and good support along the way, so we felt really well supported, and it's felt easy, to be really honest with you. And we have a regular catch up with Amanda here to make sure we're on track. And if I've got any questions about if there's something I want to do here, is that allowed, or is it negatively going to affect what we're trying to achieve? So you've sort of got this other layer of things that you need around compliance that you need to consider on an ongoing basis, but we're not finding them onerous. And so we felt the process of actually getting the registration done was pretty easy. We've got our baseline soil sampling done, and that was a fun day. And I sort of hung around and went with them as they took all the soil samples, and I was really interested in what we were seeing, what we were observing as those cores were coming out, and so it was quite informative as well. But look, we've found it. So far, touch wood, we've found it pretty easy and not very restrictive, or we haven't found it to be an administrative burden. We're already using a bit of tech, around a stocking rate and those sorts of things. And I think the fact that we were doing that's probably made it much simpler as well. That we didn't have to implement that to be compliant. We were already measuring it, but we did implement a practice change to really ramp up our stocking density.
Yeah. So when you step back from it, how do you assess the value of it, really? Just not financially, obviously there's potential revenue from the sale of carbon credits, but in terms of land management decision making, you've touched on that already.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because it's leading us to consider other things now, like virtual fencing. So we're challenging ourselves. How can we get that density up? How can we make paddock size dynamic so that we can change it to accommodate changing seasons? And again, we always try and optimize. So how can we optimize the environmental outcomes we're getting? And I think we're looking very, very hard at virtual fencing, and we think that there's something there that's quite compelling. I guess for us, we're looking at it, we're going, well, if we can get an increase in the amount of soil carbon stored above what we otherwise would have had we not changed, then we are going to hold more moisture. We are going to be for longer. We are going to grow more pasture as a function of that. If we manage our pasture in a more effective way, we can probably grow more from the same rainfall as well. So that's another benefit. And these things do ultimately flow through to the bottom line. And we are now looking at efficiency in terms of our breeder efficiency and potentially smaller, more efficient breeders that still deliver a good carcass weight growth in the progeny and those sorts of things. So we are looking in every crack and every crevice we can to optimize the business, but it's driving our thinking around pasture and decisions to maybe plant different species and see if we can get better outcomes and use those activities to also, again, come back to promoting the sequestration of carbon. So kind of lots and lots of considerations there.
Yeah, and I suppose for someone who's looking at that, curious but undecided, is there any element of that you think they really need to understand before making the call either way?
Yeah, look, I think, first and foremost, you've got to convince yourself, or you've got to satisfy yourself that there is a material benefit here. And the way we've sort of looked at it is, look, philosophically, this all makes sense to us. And the science makes sense. It philosophically makes sense. We couldn't see much downside. So, I think the cost of failure felt low to us. So, if we didn't get that big uplift in soil organic carbon, then I think we will accrue lots of other benefits anyway, that makes us feel a little bit more comfortable about the decision. But, honestly, the registration process was easy. The activities we're doing to demonstrate compliance on an ongoing basis are certainly not an impost and are probably resulting in us becoming better livestock and land managers anyway. So it's been a very pleasurable experience for us so far.
Oh, that's good to hear. There's a lot of noise right now around sustainability and carbon as well. What do you think is genuinely useful for producers and potentially what gets overstated?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that I don't like is these comparisons of, I run my farm this way and my neighbour runs his farm this way, and here's a picture of a fence line and I've got one outcome on one side and a different outcome on the other. And look, that feels divisive to me. And I get the message people are trying to convey, but I don't like the manner in which it's being done, to be really frank with you. And so, my thinking is it's like, well, let's focus on the context of my business. And, it's incumbent upon me to measure the changes that are happening on my farm as a consequence of the decisions that I'm making, or, my wife and I are making together. So, we are very focused on challenging our thinking, making decisions that feel right based on information and literature that we read. And then we're super focused on following through behind the decision and saying, well, are we seeing the outcome that we were hoping to see here? And by and large, I have to say, I think, we're seeing, really good positive changes here. But we don't just take it for granted that if we do these things, that will happen. It's like, let's constantly challenge our thinking, but we don't like to compare ourselves to others. We're just very focused on doing our own research, convincing ourselves of the best options for our business and the context of our business, and then, following through and, measuring changes that we're seeing. And, that's one of the things I love about the Carbon Project is, we will be, measuring in another couple of years' time, what changes have occurred as a consequence of the changes we've made here. And I don't know what they'll be like. I have no expectation of it. There's certainly no revenue from ACCUs in my budget, but we think that if we manage the business in such a way that we increase the carbon content, then there will be all sorts of beneficial, direct and indirect beneficial flows for the business.
Richard, that's a great summary of everything that we've dived in today, and I really thank you for being so open about your experience and perspective. I think there's a lot in there. Producers thinking about both performance and long-term land condition, and I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Vic. It's been wonderful, and I really appreciate the opportunity to work with the team at Atlas Carbon.
To all our listeners, thank you for joining me for the Stockyard Sessions podcast, proudly brought to you by Atlas Ag, the team behind Atlas Carbon and Atlas Grazing. To learn how you can optimise your grazing operation through better pasture health, stronger livestock performance and increased soil carbon, visit atlasag.com.